Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for this virtual launch of Holiday Heart. My name's Helen Vassallo and I'm delighted to be here this evening talking with author Margarita García Robayo and translator Charlotte Coombe about this powerful and provocative book from Charco Press. Many of you will remember Margarita's English language debut, Fish Soup, published by Charco Press in 2018 and also translated by Charlie. Holiday Heart has the same caustic humour and dreams of elsewhere that readers will recognise from Fish Soup, but with entirely new characters, plot and setting. Pablo and Lucía are unhappy and unpleasant people who have never quite found their place. They're Colombian by birth, but they're living in the USA in pursuit of an American dream that rapidly fades into a pretty sordid reality. We meet them at a pivotal point in their lives when everything they've constructed is disintegrating. So don't be fooled by the delightful sounding title. A Holiday Heart is not a summer romance, but a potentially fatal cardiac condition brought on by excesses of greed and lust. As you can see from the cover, designed by the ever-brilliant Pablo Font, this is an idyllic dream that has been battered by circumstance. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Margarita and Charlie. Margarita García Robayo was born in Colombia, now lives in Buenos Aires. She's the author of 3 novels, a book of autobiographical essays, and several collections of short stories, including Worse Things, which won the prestigious Casa de las Americas Prize in 2014, and which is included in Fish Soup in Charlie's translation. Charlotte Coombe is a literary translator from French and Spanish, and was recently shortlisted for the Society of Authors Valle-Inclán Prize for her translation of Fish Soup. She's also the co-founder with Tina Kova of the new YouTube channel Translators Aloud, which brings translators out of the background and into the spotlight. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for being here this evening.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, thank you, Helen, very much.
So I'll start with my first question, which is for Margarita. So English language readers will know you for Fish Soup, your first collection of novellas and short stories to be published in English by Charco in 2018. So how does Holiday Heart build on or diverge from Fish Soup?
Okay, well, I always think about my books as pieces of something bigger, which is my literary project in terms of topics and of course, narrative aesthetics. When I began to write, I wasn't like entirely aware of this, of course, but I knew that I wanted to write about something that was like bothering in my mind always, and it was the way in which the environment I grew up in, which is the Colombian Caribbean coast, was socially built up. I come from a very unequal society. We have very few rich people, we have tons of poor, and then we have the middle class. My characters, the ones in Fish Soup, the ones in Holiday Heart, the ones I guess in everything I have written till now, I guess, are located in that social strip. And my books are like an attempt to portray that universe. That is because, among other things that I found attractive about that universe, I believe our literature, I mean Latin American literature and Colombian literature in particular, hasn't dealt with it as much as it has dealt with other universes for which we are known the most in the world, such as violence, political violence, or drug dealing, or maybe dictatorships in Argentina's case, for example. And the thing is, I'm convinced that this social strip is like quite guilty of the failure of our societies as places in which everyone could feel contained. In-betweeners, as you said a few days ago, Helen, and I love the nomination, I mustn't say they because this is clearly a we. You know, we are not innocent victims of the oppression of our unfair governments. I believe that we are at least a big part of the problem, because with our behavior, with our cheap convictions, with our selfish dreams, we have built this problem, which is the problem, again, inequality in every conceivable aspect. Beside this, both of the books, Fish Soup and Holiday Heart, portrays uprooted characters looking for a sense of belonging, which they had originally given up. So I must say that my books, Fish Soup and Holiday Heart particularly, are the attempt to portray an apparently harmful social class that has built many of the vices that makes our societies increasingly unfair.
It's so interesting that you talk about a we rather than a they, because one of the things that really hit me in Holiday Heart is how it's uncomfortable to read because of the way it makes you question yourself and whether you might be complicit in some way. I shouldn't say you there, I should say we as well, whether there might be some complicity in perpetuating the attitudes that we find in there and that we denounce in there. But to go back to the they of Holiday Heart, your two main characters, Pablo and Lucia, are pretty unpleasant. They're selfish, destructive, they're snobbish, they're racist. So why did you choose to write such unlikable protagonists, and how did it feel for you to write them?
Well, this may sound controversial, you know, but I don't think of Lucia and Pablo as unlikable people or just unlikable people. They are certainly not heroes. And I do think of them as like regular middle classers, completely unsatisfied, only that they are overexposed in this story. And that is on purpose, because I believe that if you put a magnifying glass over anyone, I really think anyone, you will find many flaws you won't ever suspect he or she has. I said before that this social strip I'm referring to were guilty of the societies we live in, and I really think that, but I also think that most of them aren't aware of it. Take, for example, Lucia's parents. I'm sure that Lucia's parents' self-perception is absolutely different from Lucia and Pablo's critical version of them. But the fact is that Lucia's parents are people who bought a timeshare flat that includes a maid. But they say to themselves, oh no, she's like family to us. She's like family. And Lucia said, well, bullshit, you know, stop being hypocrite. She's a maid, so pay her well and stop the overacting. And it's a bit, you know, like complex, because you don't get to hate Lucia's parents. You hate Lucia because she deserved it in the first place, but also because she said things that are true in this bold way. And it's hard to think of you as a society like that, you know? And going precisely to the racist issue of Lucia, you know, I also think that Lucia doesn't think of herself as a racist. She's a civilized lady. She has a scholarship in Yale, blah, blah, blah. She's not a racist, of course, she must say to herself. But again, the fact is that she is so distracted while being unsatisfied that she overlooked the behavior of her little son, for example, which is a mirror of her own behavior. And he had to shout it in her face in the middle of a crowded beach to get her attention. So I think that maybe Lucia, in that simple and horrible act, learned more about herself than in any other circumstance of her life.
That's a really fascinating perspective for us to have. Thank you so much. And the way that you've just shone a light there on how we see the worst of them. We see the magnifying glass. So you're putting the magnifying glass over them and we're seeing their flaws. But of course, there's still human people that you were working with as you were writing. And that brings me to a question for Charlie. So what was it like for you to inhabit the minds of those characters as you were translating? Were there sections that you found particularly difficult to deal with as you were translating?
Yeah, I mean, I find it sort of worryingly easy to kind of inhabit the minds of bitter, broken people. I don't know what that says about me more than anything, but they're obviously, you know, as a translator, you have to learn to step like out of yourself and into somebody else's shoes. And obviously there are some quite sort of controversial things said by the characters in the book, and it was difficult to actually write certain sentences, certain paragraphs. I was like, it really, you know, I found it quite difficult. You know, all the stuff about Black people, about Pablo sexualizing this young female student. And it is difficult to bring yourself to translate those things sometimes, just as it probably is difficult for Margarita to write them. But I think the point of this is to make the reader feel uncomfortable and to confront the uncomfortable issues like this. So, for example, just one little bit I wanted to talk about, which I found quite striking, quite difficult, was the bit where Pablo is discussing sort of different skin tones, different shades of brownness, as it were. And so I'm just going to read the little bit, which is, being brown isn't an advantage, thinks Pablo. And he thinks about himself, his mother and his sisters, even Lucia. Being Black gets you further. A brown man is a watered down man stuck halfway between identities. It's impossible to construct a strong identity if you're brown. So like when I first read that, I was like, you know, my first instinct, your gut instinct was to kind of, it was like, you know, how can I make this more culturally sensitive? But obviously my job as a translator is to, you know, convey Margarita's intentions with the text and not to dampen it down, not to lessen it. So yeah, I mean, there were lots of things like that in the book that I knew would be kind of problematic. But obviously Margarita was very clear about not losing her intention with this book. So there were lots of things we had to discuss like later on during the editing process. But as Margarita was just saying, I think obviously what's so appealing about her writing is that these characters aren't just bad people. They're not just horrible, terrible, awful beings. Like, they're humans and they're very nuanced. And I think, you know, we can see that all of their flaws kind of come from their insecurities, essentially, like their rootlessness, their kind of displacement, and how that projects onto how they view other people. And there are little flashes of like where you feel sorry for them, or at least you see the reasons behind their behavior, why they're acting a certain way. You know, Pablo is kind of narcissistic and selfish, but his sadness is that he can't connect with his children or his wife. And, you know, Lucia might be sort of judgy and selfish and racist, but she has these insecurities that are so deep rooted. And like when she talks about them, saying how deeply afraid she is and this like unbearable weight that she carries every day, I just think it's just so sort of interesting, and it really helps you kind of like relate to them as humans. So yeah, I mean, it was always with Margarita's work, I find it so relatable. Like, there's a lot of bitterness in there, but there's always this dark humor. And for me, I think that's kind of like my personality, like bitterness, like interwoven with humor, essentially. So that's how I kind of so firmly am anchored to the voice of her narrative.
Thank you. Again, that's really interesting to hear your perspective on what it's like to translate things that are uncomfortable to read, because I imagine if they're uncomfortable to read, they must be uncomfortable to translate as well, but also to write. And that, you know, you were bringing it back there to Margarita's intentions in writing the book, which you are reproducing in the translation, which is difficult but brilliant. And we are in fact going to have a reading now from the first extract that you've chosen. So we'll first of all hear Margarita read it in Spanish, and then we will hear Charlie read the same extract from the translation in English. So over to you.
Okay. I go first with the
Yes.
Spanish.
Yes.
En el bar de la piscina hay atomizadores que lo rocían con agua fría, como las frutas y verduras del supermercado. Están enganchados del techo, no descubre cómo. Cada vez que se activan, siente las pequeñas gotas frías sobre los hombros, como una capa suave y húmeda. Rosa está sentada en el borde de la piscina, piernas en el agua, hablando con una niña un poco más chica que ella. Le dice que es venezolana, pero vive en Houston. Su papá es comerciante, su mamá es su mamá. ¿Por qué los venezolanos no viven en Venezuela?, le preguntará Rosa después, a la noche, antes de dormirse. Lucía pensará en sus amigas de esos casi 3 años que vivió en Caracas cuando era niña. Imaginará que alguna, o todas, viven ahí mismo, en la Florida, el destino natural para una caraqueña de clase media por esos años. Recordará a 2, Isabel y Olga, flotando en los colchones inflables en la piscina del club, sonriendo malteadas de fresa. Y ese recuerdo durará 2, 3 segundos. Después pasará otra cosa, a Bogotá, a la finca de su abuela materna en la montaña, donde la cuidaba cuando tenía la edad de Rosa y su papá se la pasaba viajando vendiendo tubos para la industria petrolera. Su mamá lo acompañaba, la maleta llena de vestidos para cócteles. Lucía siempre la imaginó sobrevestida en las sociales de esa empresa ínfima. Su papá, uno entre 4 socios, usaba el eufemismo de en expansión, que pedía a gritos ser absorbida por una multinacional. Cuando eso ocurrió, pasaron de Bogotá a Caracas y de Caracas a México, de La Calera a La Castellana a Coyoacán. La trasplantaron como un árbol varias veces, sin darle tiempo de enraizarse.
Thank you. And now we're going to hear the same extract from Charlie in English.
The pool bar has misters that sprinkle them with cold water, like the fruit and vegetables in the supermarket. They're attached to the ceiling, but she can't work out how. Every time they turn on, she feels the tiny droplets of cold water settle on her shoulders like a gentle, dewy cape. Rosa is sitting at the poolside, dangling her legs in the water, talking to a girl slightly younger than her. The girl tells her she's Venezuelan, but they live in Houston. Her daddy is a salesman, her mummy is her mummy. Why don't Venezuelans live in Venezuela? Rosa will ask Lucia later that night before bed. Lucia will think about her friends from those 3 years or so when she lived in Caracas as a child. She'll imagine that one of them, or all of them, lived right here in Florida, the natural destination for a middle-class woman from Caracas at that time. She'll remember 2 of them, Isabel and Olga, floating on lilos in the club pool, sipping on strawberry milkshakes. That memory will last 2 or 3 seconds, then she'll move on to another, to Bogotá, to the farm in the mountains belonging to her maternal grandmother, who looked after her when she was Rosa's age, while her dad spent his time traveling, selling pipes for the oil industry. Her mum went with him, her suitcase packed full of cocktail dresses. Lucia always imagined her dressed up to the nines at the social events of that tiny company. Her dad, one of 4 partners, employed the euphemism expanding, which was crying out to be acquired by a multinational. When the inevitable happened, they moved from Bogotá to Caracas, and from Caracas to Mexico, from La Calera to La Castellana, and then to Coyoacán. Lucia was transplanted like a tree never given time to put down roots. Tomás announces that he's thirsty. She finds him next to her, sitting on a stool, clutching the book that she'd kept in her bag. She orders a lemonade for him and a margarita for herself. Tomás gulps down the lemonade, ending with a sigh. Are you bored? Asks Lucia. He shakes his head vigorously. Do you want to join Rosa and her friend? Tomás repeats the gesture. I don't like Venezuelans. Lucia strokes his hair. Whenever the children ask where she is from, Lucia tells them, from here, from our house. They study their surroundings as if looking for some distinguishing feature, but their house is practically identical to all the other houses on the street.
Thank you. So we had there the sense of uprootedness that Margarita was talking about in one of her answers to the earlier questions. So really fascinating extract there. And what I want to return to right now is the title of this novel, because the original title in Spanish is Tiempo Muerto, or Dead Time. But Margarita, with the translation, you were able to reclaim the title that you had originally wanted to give the novel, Holiday Heart. Can you explain the significance of each title and the possibilities that the translation opened up for you?
Yes, I'm very happy that the book recovers its name, really. It was original title, Holiday Heart. It came up while writing the novel. The thing is, my husband is a film director, and he was releasing by that time a documentary about meat. In fact, about the famous Argentinian asado. It is called Todo sobre el asado, and it is in Netflix when I watch it. But the thing, I was watching the final cut of this documentary, and I saw this doctor. He was very funny, a cardiologist, talking about how meat can kill people. He was asked, like, doctor, can asado kill? And he said, like, sure, it can. Especially if you put a lot of salt in it and mix it with wine, or maybe, well, one thing leads to another, so maybe some drugs and then sex. It was hilarious because it was the same as if he said, and you put a gun in your forehead and pull the trigger while chewing, you know, it was really funny. But then he explained the condition, the holiday heart syndrome, and I found it fascinating as a metaphor, because it completed the whole picture I was already drawing for Pablo in the novel, like perfectly healthy hearts exposed to excesses they were not used to. And this was like a regular guy ravaged by frustration and dissatisfaction that becomes then like self-destructive. So I found it like perfect for this story. But well, then the Spanish editors didn't find it like striking enough, because they always wanted Spanish title and they insisted in changing it. So I came up with Tiempo Muerto, which is Dead Time. And it was also very eloquent. You said eloquent or eloquent? I don't know, but if you get it. In terms of the relationship of Pablo and Lucia at that time. But well, as I said, I always wanted Holiday Heart, so I'm like fascinated by the fact that it has the name that I choose for it.
So Dead Time, then, Tiempo Muerto, indicates that accumulation of time that is basically all that Pablo and Lucia's relationship amounts to, whereas Holiday Heart indicates the illness in which all of their misery is crystallized. Either way, it's quite a bleak view of human relationships. So what made you decide to tackle this?
Well, that time, you know, to inhabit that time in relationships which is like feel stuck. I think that it is a state where you can fall easily. Relationships, all kind of relationships, needs like hard working, but you can always, you know, when things start to break, you can always disregard alarms and cauterize emotional wounds and keep going. In some way, it is simple because it was what we usually do with other horrible things that surround us, such as injustice or poverty or selfishness. We shut down, we escape from them until you can't escape anymore, because no one can escape forever. The last part of this novel show us Lucia and her children driving up to nowhere, and she ends up facing the last limit possible for any human being, which is the horizon. And on the other hand, it shows us Pablo completely devastated, without his job, without his family, fantasizing about leaving his home, but knowing at the same time that it's too late for him. Not too late for leaving, because I believe that anyone can leave whenever they want, but to find a place of his own, a place that feels like home, because the thing is that he lost it a long time ago, that conception of home, and Lucia did it too. So well, that's what the title is. It's about that time.
Thank you. And my next question is for both of you. What has it been like to have this translation come out not only at a time of global crisis, but also at a moment when anti-racism movements are making international headlines. So were you worried that people would focus only on that aspect of the characters, or perhaps read Holiday Heart critically because it tackles racism by presenting characters that embody it?
Well, I don't know. I start, or Charlie, you want to say?
I'll just say one thing quickly and then I'll let you talk. I mean, I think it's a really great timing for it to come out, because it's time to confront these prejudices that exist. And I think, you know, if there's always potential for people to only focus on that. I mean, this book is about so many other things. But even if they do just focus on that, I think that's a good thing. You know, seeing these characters with all their flaws, I think is, you know, it forces readers to recognize these prejudices and not just sort of pretend they don't exist. But yeah, I'll let Margarita speak more to that.
Right. Well, I agree totally. I choose to illuminate some aspects of the characters. I choose to talk about some vices, not only racism, as Charlie says. There are many others pointed out in the novel, I believe, but vices of a social class, again, and geography that I know well. But then, as I said before, referring to Lucia's characters, the characters don't think of themselves in those terms, because that is exactly the point, you know. Of course, that I as an individual, I can see them and I can say they are not only racist, they are especially classist, you know. I don't know if there's a word in English to describe this more. Classist, like the same as racism, but with social class.
Classes.
Yeah.
Okay. They are especially classes, but then, and here comes my answer, I guess. I don't know, to read a book in a critical way, meaning in a negative way, because it contains behaviors or characters that I, as an individual, I don't approve. I think for me it is like a very limited and a very sad vision of what literature means and what literature has to offer to us as readers. And beside us, I'm completely against, you know, like making invisible, which is the same as not naming the ugly things of the world because they bother us or because they make us uncomfortable. That won't be ever like a path for me, because I believe in the opposite, you know. And I maybe some of this, to get through some of these things, maybe some people need context, you know, and I know that, for example, translators surely need context, and editors need context, and maybe some readers also need it. So I'll be happy to give them context, but to modify or erase, you know, like some things because they result uncomfortable to anyone. I'm not, you know, into that. Also, I would like to insist in something that I don't know if I said it before, because I have this short time loss of memory in the quarantine. I don't remember anything anymore. But I don't know if I said before that I really think that many people that we won't ever consider racist are racist, the same as many men and women who proclaim themselves as feminists, for example, and they're quite the opposite. But why is this? It is because I think it's, you know, especially in our, you know, stratified societies as Latin societies, or maybe not only stratified, but colonial societies, because as you may know, Charlie and Helen, in Latin America, we remain being colonies in so many ways. So especially in our colonial societies, these kind of behaviors are so internalized in our idiosyncrasy that we hardly notice it until it explodes in our faces. We can naturalize outbursts because we grew up listening to outbursts, and many of them came from our family, from our relatives, and we never consider our family or close friends as horrible people until maybe someone or something from the outside, or maybe just a change of place and perspective, pointed at something specific and enlightened us. And it was kind of a discovery, like, oh, we are horrible people. So I don't think that Lucia and Pablo are more horrible people than any of the middle classes family with whom I grew up. I think that they are certainly more bitter, and that surely they feel like morally superior because they were able to leave their colonial land for a free one, but well, then we already know how it went.
Thank you. I think we're going to hear a second extract from Holiday Heart now. So again, we'll go to Margarita first to read in Spanish, and then Charlie will read the same section in English.
Okay. En la cama piensa en la vida de Letty y se deprime. No sabe por qué. No conoce a muchas personas que se muestren tan satisfechas con su vida como se muestra ella. A él, sin embargo, le da tristeza. Le vienen a la cabeza los clientes de la lavandería, casi todos latinos. O sea que la tía Letty emigró de Montería, huyéndole al destino probable de convertirse con mucha suerte en la secretaria de alguien, para venir a lavarle la mierda a gente más corroncha que ella y que toda su familia junta. Recordó las tardes de viernes en Port Chester, cuando llegaba a su casa, a la casa de su tía, para encontrarse con las bolsas de ropa limpia en el comedor, rotuladas a mano y listas para ser repartidas por la mañana. Al principio, Pablo tenía la fantasía tonta de irse a pasear los fines de semana o de entrar al Capitol Theatre, lo único lindo que había en Port Chester, a escuchar un concierto, pero en lugar de eso se la pasaba entregando ropa hedionda pachulí con fondo de fritura. Se iba el olor a vómito, a grajo, a orín, a caca, pero a fritura jamás. En la familia se decía que Letty había sabido ser una morena bella y juiciosa, y estaban todos orgullosos de que hubiera podido irse. Va a llegar lejos, recuerda a su abuela diciendo eso con la cara empantanada en lágrimas. Cada Navidad y cada fin de año, cuando hablaban con ella por teléfono, y ahí estaba, lejos, deshaciéndose de la mugre latina y volviendo sobre ella todos los días en un loop que le gastaría la vida. ¿Se casó la tía Letty? No, estaba muy ocupada lavando ropa. Ahorró lo suficiente para dejar de trabajar. En Estados Unidos, como decía ella, nunca es suficiente. Novios, nada formal. Polvos, eventuales. Hobbies, el bingo. Ahí, pensó Pablo, en ese vicio ordinario y pequeñito, estaba su felicidad.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from Charlie.
In bed, he thinks about Letty's life and feels depressed. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know many people who seem as contented with their life as she seems to be, yet she makes him feel sad. He thinks about the laundrette. Almost all the customers are Latinos. In other words, his aunt Letty emigrated from Montería, escaping the likely fate of becoming, at best, somebody's secretary, only to end up cleaning the dirty underwear of people who are even bigger hicks than her and her entire family put together. He remembered the Friday evenings in Port Chester, when he'd arrive at his aunt's house to find bags of clean clothing in the dining room, labelled by hand, ready for delivery in the morning. At first, Pablo had a silly fantasy of going out for strolls at the weekends, or going to a concert at the Capitol Theatre, the only beautiful thing about Port Chester. Instead of which, he spent his time delivering clothes reeking of patchouli with an undertone of fried food. The smell of vomit, body odour, piss and shit came out, but fried food, never. The family always used to say that Letty knew how to make the best of her brown-skinned beauty and her intelligence, and they were all so proud that she'd managed to get out of there. She'll go far, he remembers his grandmother saying, her face wet with tears, every Christmas and every New Year's Eve when they spoke to her on the phone. And here she was, far away, cleaning off the Latino grime and coming back to it every day in an endless loop that would wring the life out of her. Did Aunt Letty get married? No, she was too busy laundering clothes. Did she save enough money for retirement? In the USA, as she used to say, nothing was ever enough. Boyfriends? Nothing serious. Sex? Occasionally. Hobbies? Bingo. There, thought Pablo, in that common little vice, was where she found her joy.
Thank you. So my next question is for Margarita. Holiday Heart as we've discussed, is quite critical of a certain kind of Latin American stereotype. So specifically the in-betweeners in terms of class, place and race, a kind of middle class that absorbs the prejudices of the upper classes against the lower classes and absorbs the resentment of the lower classes towards the upper classes. So could you talk a little more about why you wanted to shine a light on these aspects in particular? And I'd be also very interested to know what the reaction to Holiday Heart was when it was released in Spanish, whether it was released just in Argentina, throughout Latin America, perhaps in Spain also. So.
Okay, yes, maybe I pointed some of this in before again, I don't remember, but it doesn't matter. I would love to insist in this. I really think that we should look carefully, more carefully to this social strip, because it's the kind of people that tells you, like how many sacrifices they make and how great effort they invest in educating themselves and their children and working with the sweat of their foreheads and all that justifications of the kind of people they finally become. It's like I'm talking here, I'm talking about individualism. I think that individualism is our worst sin. And I believe Pablo said something to this effect about her sister Meredith in the novel. He said, she is always defending herself and the square meter of territory where her little family rooted. He is certainly talking about individualism. But again, these people could be any people I know. It's, we are like so possessed, is the word. We are so possessed by our self-sufficiency for having fulfilled a dream with so much effort, a dream that in most of the cases starts by leaving our hometown, that we hardly have the energy to care about anyone else. To which, to finish my answer, I think that this book, yes, it was published in Spain and in Latin America, in more than one territory. And I believe that this book was well written, especially in Latin America, because people were able to recognize the characters and even in some cases to feel represented in a way that make them wonder, do we sound like this when we said exactly the same sentence, don't we? Well, yes, we do.
That's immensely powerful for literature to achieve that, and goes back to what we were saying earlier about holding up a mirror, but in a very different context. And so my next question is for Charlie. We've just been discussing these culturally specific features, things that are very particular to Latin America. So how do they travel when you translate? Was there anything that you had to consider in terms of the difference in audience reception? And tied into that, you were working with Fionn Petch as your copy editor at Charco. So could you then tell us a little bit more about the discussions that you had, or any features that might have been changed or altered in the translation?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think obviously, as Margarita was just saying, I guess she's kind of answered my question for me. I was going to say the same thing, which is, these people, it is sort of this specific Latin American stereotype that she's kind of portraying in the book, but this idea of these particular level of society, like the middle, the people in between, the people who, like she said, are sort of trying to find their place in the world by kind of justifying the way the decisions they made, etc. That's quite universal. So I think it does, I think everyone can see elements of themselves in these characters. So yeah, I think whatever country you come from, especially in this more globalized world where people are, as you said, really individualistic, this is, I think it's relevant, kind of, they travel well in a way, if you know what I mean. And in terms of considering audience reception, I think, as a translator into English, you know that this book in English is going to be read sort of in the UK, in the USA, in any country in the world where people are reading English. So I think as a translator, you do have to think more about who's reading it than perhaps you do as a writer. Like, it's quite an interesting question, actually, like, who does a writer write for? Do they think about their audience when they're writing? I think a lot of writers don't necessarily, but as a translator, you know, who am I translating for? I'm translating for the author primarily, but then also you do consider reader reception, I think maybe more, but I mean, I think that's probably part of a bigger debate. But so the main sort of challenge in this translation was keeping Margarita's intentions, while also at points there were things that we had to consider, like, do these need to be made slightly different, like in English, where appropriate or where possible. So in terms of like the racial terminology and how Black people are portrayed, there was one particular sort of element of that which is a sort of a linguistic difference that we discussed quite at length during the editing process. So the word negro, which means black, in Spanish, when it's frequently repeated in a text, might not carry the same sort of weight that it does in an English text. So we had long discussions about whether the frequent repetition of el negro, los negros in the Spanish was a attempt to draw more emphasis to the racist element of the character, or if it was just literally like a feature of Spanish that, you know, so that's what we had a lot of discussion about that, didn't we? So yeah, and we were very keen to like not lessen the impact and not make it less harsh than it was intended to be, but at the same time there is a difference in English to Spanish with these words. So yeah, there was a few sort of problematic particular phrases that we had to kind of hammer out between myself and Fionn and Carolina and Margarita, and a long sort of email chain of discussing how best to do these things. So yeah, and with every time with Charco, it's a very collaborative process during the editing, which I think is great, because it really, you get to the best end result with a text, and you know that you've considered something from every angle, because you've got different, you know, the editor and the author in this case, like having their input and making sure that you haven't missed something or misrepresented something. So yeah, a lot of the discussions were to do with that side of things. And also there was quite a big discussion about some slang and colloquial words in the text, which things like naco and corroncha, and I think Margarita suggested maybe keeping some of those in Spanish, and we did consider that, but in the end we didn't, just because they're sort of one-off mentions. So in a text that has a lot of like slang and you know, it's kind of littered with lots of these things, the reader in English would come to understand what they mean, but when it's just a one-off, it would make it it would interrupt the flow and maybe remove some of the humor and kind of detract from the reading experience. So with some of those things, yeah, we had a big discussion about those as well. But yeah, I mean, trying to think what else. Translation is it's always about that. It's like, what do you lose? What do you gain? How do you mitigate that and kind of come to the best text in the end in English without losing the flavor of the original? Yeah, we had a very last minute discussion about like UK versus US English as well, because we changed a few things last minute in the text to make it more authentic to the location that the people are in. And that's an interesting thing as well, because as a British translator, there's often things I don't notice. So naturally I would use a certain word, whereas an American reader would never use that word or wouldn't even understand what it meant. So, you know, dummy versus pacifier, things like that, they got changed right at the last minute, which I'm actually really glad that we had the chance to do those last minute edits. So yeah, it was quite a long editing process actually, but a good one, a very like productive one, I think. And I'm very happy with how it all turned out, so I'm hoping Margarita is too.
You said there, Charlie, that Margarita was involved in the editing process, but I wondered whether you'd had any discussion with her while you were translating.
No, not really. Like, we haven't really been in touch much. Like, usually how it works is I'll send any queries via the publisher, via Carolina, and then she'll send them on to Margarita, and then yeah, we've never really, like, this is the first time we've actually kind of met in ever.
Yes,
Which is crazy. But yeah, no, we didn't really discuss like one-on-one during the translation process or editing process, but she read the final draft and then gave us her feedback, and then we worked with that to make sure that it was how she wanted it to be.
It sounds like a really thorough process of the translating and editing. You mentioned that that's something that Charco do. How does that compare with other experiences you might have had? Or perhaps I should rephrase and say, what are the positives of having such a collaborative approach that you've been describing?
Well, I think just the fact that you get to, because as a translator, it can be very isolated. You can be sitting there in your room working on a book for like 6 months, and you don't see things that other people see. So an editor can read it and go, oh, hang on, this isn't quite right, and can spot things that you would never in a million years see. And then if you add another, so Carolina always is involved as well, because you know she knows the book so well. She gets involved with the editing, and that's also, I think it just helps to work and rework certain tricky bits that you aren't quite sure of as a translator, because there's always some paragraphs that you're like, I just don't know if I've nailed it. And then by talking to other people, suddenly you have that light bulb moment and you're like, it should be this, that's how it should be. And then you are sure that you've got it right. So I think it's very beneficial, I think, having a slightly more collaborative process, because other publishers, you don't always have that. You submit it, you speak to your editor, and that's kind of it, really. So yeah, it's different, definitely.
Thank you. I love having that insight into how we end up with the finished text as readers. I'm going to ask another question to Margarita now. You've written elsewhere in your collection of personal essays, which I have here, Primera Persona, about the pressures faced by women when they have children. So was that one of the things that prompted you to write about Lucia's experience?
Well, yes, definitely. The most difficult thing about writing Holiday Heart, I believe, was that I wanted to say like many things about many topics. I was, for example, I don't know, I remember now, I was like obsessed with feeding, but not feeding itself, but the fact that everyone suddenly seems like so preoccupied of what they should eat or shouldn't eat. And while the other topic, big issue for me then, was motherhood. Maybe because I was a new mom, and I realized that it was kind of a fraud for women, because like you have like, at last you have like this very important thing for your deepest affection that you care so much about, and then everything else was like still the same, you know, nothing modified because of that. Yeah, like your job, your friends, your boyfriend, and you still cared about everything else, but like your performance as a mother doesn't nullify your performance as a person. And sometimes I thought, well, it should, because why am I being asked for the same commitment as if I don't have this huge mission, which is raising a new little person? So I think that I put all of that neurosis in Lucia's character, like this kind of self-imposed over demand that sometimes comes with motherhood, and I like lo filtré, how do you say, filtrated in that character. So yes, definitely it was one of the motivations of the book.
And I have to ask, and the reason I'm asking this is because when we last met to talk about Fish Soup, you revealed that some of the characters in the novella Sexual Education were based on real people. So we've talked about the general characteristics that you've observed and that you show us in Holiday Heart, but are any of the characters themselves based on real people, or is it just generalizations that you've observed that you are crystallizing in your main characters?
Well, I always almost everything I have written, I believe, they are based on an experience, you know, like something, and or when it isn't an experience, it is like a very close observation of things that I found familiar for me, you know. It's that the kind of method maybe that I use. The characters are also like based always in something I have seen, but I always, you can like copy the exact, how do you say, contours of anyone. So I always mix them up or divide it, or sometimes I just invent it from scratch. Even the one in sexual education are kind of mixed up, although everything that I tell in that story is absolutely real, you know, as I told you the time we met before. But the characters, no, my characters doesn't exist, you know. They are like based on maybe someone or many people, but they don't, you know, have like a cedula or a document you can find them. But yes, I like to use my experience a lot in what I do, and that involves also the characters construction.
Thank you. I have one final question for you now that goes back to some of the things that Charlie was saying in her last response. So what does it mean to you to have your work published in English and to engage with a different audience?
Yes, well, my first book in English, which was Fish Soup, also translated by Charlie, it was a pleasure. You know, it was a very lovable experience. I had like really valuable readings. I enjoy very much the readers' opinions. And it felt to me very natural to read myself in English because I love the language. I have consumed this language since I was a little girl, although I don't practice it at all. So that is why this is so difficult for me to speak like fluently and long and in the middle makes sense. It's really difficult, but I really like the language. With Holiday Heart, I was a bit more nervous because of what Charlie just said, because it requires, this is something that you can say of almost every book, or every book, Charlie may know, that it requires a translation not only of the language, but some things about, in this book specifically, about idiosyncrasy, and not the funny things of idiosyncrasy, but the ugly ones, the kind of vices that I was trying to explain in this whole conversation. And especially when the idiosyncrasy, the Latin idiosyncrasy, is so different from the English one, you know, it's really different. It's like another universe. And I realize now that, for example, I don't know, it's like for English readers, the characters seems like extremely unlikable, which is right, because they are. But although I'm not with this thing of empathizing with the characters, I don't believe in that. You know, I don't think that is necessarily for a novel, except for the fact that sometimes the absence of empathy prevents comprehension, you know, full comprehension. So that is what bothers me, you know, that if you focus only in the negative things of the characters, oh, I hate these people, you don't get into what I'm really trying to say in the book. So that's the risk, you know, of the absence of empathy with characters, which, well, you have read other books of mine, Helen, so you may know that I don't do like lovable characters, you know, I don't care, I don't really care about that, but in sometimes, as in this one, I'm afraid it could prevent comprehension. That's it. But well, as far as I can see, at least for now, the reviews has been like really good, and in some cases brilliant, as George. So thank you very much again. And also some messages I have received from the readers. So maybe I just don't have to be, you know, like afraid of any of this, but here I am crossing fingers anyway for that.
Thank you so much. We're going to end the question and answer session with Margarita and Charlie there. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much to both Margarita and Charlie for sharing such thoughtful and generous responses to my questions. And I believe that now there is going to be a live question and answer session with Charco Press. So thank you to everybody who has attended this virtual launch.
Thank you.
Thank you.